My
for people.
friends, we
From
are all
there,
in great
ships loaded
danger. Earth,
made their way to
the
the
great
Americas,
machine,
where the enslaved Africans
Elixir,
were sold in
and
exchange
the
for goods like
human.
sugar and tobacco before the
Darkness
ships made their
walks
way back.
among us.
It's
We
estimated
are
that over
all
the
in
course of the Middle
great
Passage,
danger.
2 million
My
African
kind
captives
must
died.
survive.
Their bodies often tossed
Please,
overboard. Some
send
people
help.
might not know about the
There
slave
is
trade,
not much
is that the
time.
vast majority of people did not actually go to the United States. In fact, far from it. Only about 5%
What?
of captured Africans were brought directly
Where?
or eventually to countries. Large around 41% were women, while
No,
millions of others were scattered across islands and
she's
territories.
already
Now,
here.
we examined that tradition from its earliest moments
Please,
when the war first taking
anyone.
effect, all the way to the end of the Civil War. It's important to lift up the narratives and accounts of enslaved people themselves, as they can provide us with a perspective on this horrific institution in ways that few other documents can. For example, Alada Equiano, an African captured as a boy, wrote his 1789 autobiography, The Interesting Narrative by Alada Equiano,
That's another
about the
one.
experience of being
They
captured
all scan
and
the
taken to
same.
the edge of the ocean
Empty.
and being boarded onto the ship.
Why did
I
the
was immediately
darkness
handled
invite us
and
here?
tossed up to see if I were sound by some,
You're quiet today.
and I was now
Yeah.
persuaded that I had
It's
gotten
just,
into a world of
we
that
keep
view,
coming face to face with darkness.
their
And
complexion
every time we fail to
differing
stop
so
it,
much from ours,
we're just so
their long hair,
powerless.
the language they spoke, which was very
I'm
different
picking up
from
a
any
distress
I'd
signal.
ever heard,
Someone's in
united
trouble.
to me firmly with when I looked around the ship's chute
It's
and saw a large
Varix.
furnace
He
with
hasn't
common
a lot to
boiling
answer for.
and a multitude of black people like descriptions.
I'll send a message to let
Everyone
Zavala know.
No,
countenance
wait.
expressing
Where's the signal
rejection,
coming from?
sorrow,
Here.
no longer doubted
Europa.
my fate, and quite overpowered with horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck. Think, captured Africans didn't really have an
I've
understanding
tracked
of what
Varix's distress signal beyond the
enslaved
ridge.
Africans
We'd better
weren't coming
hurry.
back to Africa from the Americas and warning people about what happened. All people
So
knew
Varix traded the
was what they
prison of
saw in front
elders
of
for this?
them, a large
I
ship,
guess if I played a
and
part in
with
the murder of Queen Six, I'd hide on a
many of these
desolate moon myself.
people speaking a language they had never heard, with a colored skin, some of them they'd never seen. It's also important to note that the story is not as simple as Africans being hunted and captured by Europeans and forced onto ships against their will. The Africans who were taken and placed on board these ships were typically prisoners of war from other African tribes, people deemed criminals, poor members of society who were often traded to pay off their debt. Which is to say,
We're
many
close to the
captured
origin
Africans were
point of
sold to
Varix's
Europe
distress signal.
by other Africans for a range of different goods. Now, this fact can sometimes be used as bad faith to obfuscate the horrors of what the Europeans did. While it's important not to ignore the fact that there were Africans trading other Africans in bondage, we should remember that being a prisoner of war or a poor member of society traded for goods is not the same thing as being held in intergenerational,
Those fallen
hereditary
patrols are
chattel
right where
slavery
we're going.
that makes your
The
children,
campsite.
their
They
children,
must be after
their
Varix
children
too.
would all be born
Let's
into
hurry.
bondage. That is something unique to the experience of slavery in the Americas. As the scholar Orlando Patterson has written, slavery is determinate, violent, personal domination of aliens, hated, and generally dishonest. You've likely heard about how horrible the conditions were on slaves, but it's worth naming. Listen, conditions on these ships were horrific. People were packed by the hundreds alongside one another, chained down, unable to move, captured out to the forced to remove themselves and places where they slept, sat, and ate. As a result, they spent at the bottom of the ship. There was little ventilation. It's unbearable. Disease was rampant. From yellow fever to malaria, from smallpox to dysentery, it is difficult to capture how abhorrent this is. So imagine this. It's helpful to hear from the piano. I'm down under the deck. There, I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life. So that the motion of the stench flying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to breathe. The motion the heat of my added to the number. So loud and it was almost suffocating. This produced copious
These fallen had
respiration,
an unfamiliar
so that
house
the
symbol.
air soon became
Who
unfit
are
for
we dealing
respiration
with?
from a variety of
Someone's been
smoke
staying here.
and brought on a sickness
There's
among the
traces
slaves.
of
With many,
darkness energy.
violence against captured Africans was a devastating yet ubiquitous phenomenon as these ships crossed the Atlantic. In an effort to keep people submissive over the course of their several weeks-long trip, enslaved Africans were tortured in a variety of cruel,
There must be a
just
reason the distress
unimaginable
signal brought us here.
sexual violence.
Let's look around.
It was not uncommon for sailors to rape enslaved women while they were on
It's
board.
Bray
But
Town,
enslaved
from
people
Eventide,
didn't just
Clovis
pass
Bray's
the
Golden
accepted
Age
conditions
colony
that
here on
thrust
Europa.
onto them.
Whoever was
They
here was
resisted
using it to track
period.
barracks too.
Some of
They
these
must
waves
have
were
intercepted the
visual,
distress signal before
some
we
of them
did.
were collective. All of them were
Okay,
attempts to
I've got the
reclaim
signal's true
some
origin
sense
point
of
now.
agency and
It's not
control
far. Let's hurry.
this inconceivable circumstance. Sometimes they were as explicit as staging revolts meant to overthrow the crew. And sometimes they included individual acts of resistance, like refusing to eat or jumping over. Now, the idea of trying to take one's own life might seem like a strange sort of resistance to some. What you have to consider is that these captured Africans represented money, real money, those who were holding them in chains on these ships. For someone attempting to take their own life represented the ability to determine the outcome of your life for yourself, rather than having it imposed on you by someone else. It also allowed them to undermine economic potential that undergirded entire institutions. Furthermore, in the case of jumping overboard, some of the captured Africans' spiritual gave them the sense that they could just make it into the water. The ocean would carry their bodies home. Sometimes, as a result, the enslavers on the ship would net on the side of the boat to prevent them from jumping. One of the most famous responses came in the form of something called speculum or which was a screw-like device that forced someone's mouth open and allowed the resistant African to be forced fed. It was not uncommon for this device to break someone's teeth, displace their jaw, or rip their mouth. If that didn't work, other interventions included placing hot coals on a person's lips so they opened their mouth, or thumbscrews, a device in which the victim's fingers were told were placed in a vice and slowly crushed until they could fly. Given all this, we should be clear that the decision millions made to stay alive in the face of unimaginable violence and uncertainty, that was an act of resistance. Historian Martin Whitaker identified the period of 1708 as the most destructive time in transatlantic trade. Roughly 2/3 of the total of enslaved Africans trafficked out of Africa to the Americas. What's more, the death toll of the transatlantic slave trade is just staggering. According to historian Bill Moore, for every 100 people taken from African period, only 64 of them would survive the trip to the coast of sea. Of those 64, only around 48 would survive the weeks-long journey across the Atlantic. Of those 48 who stepped off the ship, only 28 to 30 would survive the first 3 to 4 years of the flight. Before we go on, a quick note here about language. Throughout this series, we will try to be consistent with the term slave rather than slave to refer to African and African descended people who are held here in the home. This distinction is important because saying enslaved person or enslaved worker or enslaved human being centers the personhood of that individual and emphasizes that slavery is a condition that was involuntarily imposed on someone rather than being an inherent condition to someone. One of the central players in the slave trade was the English Royal African Company, a chartered firm that maintained a monopoly on all English trade in Africa modeled in the 1760s. The period of 1675 to 1725 represented the most active years of the Royal African Company, but it continued to play an active role in the first several decades of the 18th, an era known as free trade. The irony of that term is not often. I think it's worth honing in on one thing in its particular relationship to free trade, in order to better understand how this thing is made. According to the work of historian Ira Berlin, the state of South Carolina prohibited the African slave trade beginning in 1787. In 1803, however, the state reopened the transatlantic trade. It remained open until 1808, but the federal prohibition of the Atlantic slave trade went into effect. Between 1803 and 1808, over 35,000 enslaved people were brought to South Carolina, more than twice as many as in any similar period in its history as a colony or state. The coast of Charleston was the point of entry for approximately 40% of the enslaved Africans. This has led some to refer to it as African Americans' Ellis Island, though in obvious difference is that one group came here via their own free will, and one group did not. The federal government ended the international slave trade in 1808. The British had done so in 1807. However, traders from both nations continued illegally trafficking captive Africans many years later. While the international slave trade was abolished in the United States, the domestic slave trade would continue. In Britain, it took another quarter century before slavery was officially abolished in 1833. And in the United States, it took almost another 16 years in our nation's deadliest war. And Spanish and Brazilian traders continued trafficking Africans for another half century. Brazil, which remember had the largest portion of enslaved people trafficked across the ocean,
Barracks must have really
was
done
the
it this
final
time.
country in the Western
If we
world
don't
to
get to
abolish
him
slavery,
first, someone else
doing so
will.
in 1880.
If it's not
The
already too
bottom line is
late.
that the transatlantic slave trade was a cruel, violent, abhorrent, centuries-long project
Darkness.
that would shape
It's
the
close.
trajectory of the
I feel
world
it, but
into both black
it's
and white light
different somehow.
in ways that we'll come to more fully understand. We'll continue to talk about some of these in our next few episodes. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is thought out. Crash Course is a Complexity production, and if you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everybody, forever, you can support the series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content that you like. Thank you to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible with their continued support.
Hey, did you know there is a government-funded education grant that can deposit up to $38,070 directly into your bank account? That's right. Anyone who is unemployed or currently makes less than $80,000 a year may qualify. So if you're tired of living paycheck to paycheck and you can't afford to go back to school or earn your degree, this is your chance. This money can keep all expenses approved while you're in your classes. Childcare costs, housing, groceries, gas, and more.
Not
The
only
best
a
part,
traitor, but
this
a
money
thief.
does not need to be
Now,
paid back.
where is
So
it?
don't miss out on this opportunity
Safe from
that
you.
millions of Americans are already taking advantage of. To see if
Search
you
the
qualify to
buildings.
receive,
Find
just
it.
complete a simple 1-minute form. Get started, click the link below right now. On the next page, you'll answer a few questions, and hey, you'll be done in no time. Don't miss out on this program.
Old
Click
friend.
the link, get started
These
today.
powers, they create chaos. They are changing you. This.
Cling to your machine god. With this power, we make our own fate. Always playing pretend. Living in the past. I should have
What are you doing? I just want to see you go.
Make an example of him.
Charlie, I think you need to leave.
I'm sorry. I screwed up. Something I didn't see coming.
Barracks should be just up ahead.
And I just want you to know that from now on, I'm gonna handle everything. You might be hearing some pretty bad things about us. And they're liars. And I want you to know right now that everything I do for you. For us.
I think everything's gonna be okay. And why don't we talk about this later? I don't think I'm feeling that good, and I'm gonna go upstairs and lay down. So maybe you should leave the house and let me rest for a while.
Oh, look at me. I'm filthy. Let's go. I'll clean up.
Kevin Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. Today, we're talking about slavery in the American colonies. In your high school U.S. history class, there's a decent chance you learned about mercantilism, a system in which home countries, or a mother country in Western Europe, established extensions of themselves in far-off places around the world to produce highly sought-after raw materials. One of the basic concepts is that exports must always be greater than imports to make a profit. Simple enough. And as is the case with most businesses, one must consider how to maximize their profit. And one of the ways to do that is to minimize production costs. It's basic econ 101, right? For what it's worth, I never did too well in economics, but even I think I understand this. But how do you reduce production costs when those costs rely almost entirely on manual labor? Well, for the British colonists, the answer was just to have workers you didn't pay, which is to say, slavery. In high school, many of our history textbooks provide a broad, but not always overview of the role that slavery played in the early American
That's
economy.
where Barrett's signal is coming from.
They don't always make clear how slavery was handling the accepted practice in the first place, and how it contributed to the colony's early economic system. In the future United States, in what is now the state of South Carolina, a Spanish magistrate founded the colony San Miguel de Guadalupe in 1526, unknown number of slave Africans. But the colony was a failure, though some historians suggest that the Africans fled to the Wale Indians to set up their own colony. Nearly a century later, 20 to 30 captured Africans, or 20 and odd Negroes, as they were referred to, arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. It is the arrival of this group that has come to represent the origins of chattel slavery in the United States, because they were the first to arrive to an English colony, a colony that would, a century and a half later, become the United States. These captives would become instrumental to the success of the Jamestown colony, which succeeded where previous colonies had failed. We might imagine the first group of African captives to be foreign to the New World, but they had already had significant contact with Europeans, particularly those from Spain and Portugal. They were part of a group historian Ira Berlin describes as Atlantic Creoles. They were versed in many languages, had some familiarity with Christianity, and sometimes even worked alongside white indentured servants. Europeans did attempt to utilize other sources of labor before turning to enslaved Africans. But the indentured servitude of European immigrants posed issues that prevented colonists from extracting long-term systemic labor. For one, European indentured servants could only legally be indentured for a contracted period of time, usually somewhere between 4 and 7 years. When their contracts expired, new indentured laborers had to be found, trained, which resulted in inconsistent levels of production. Secondly, well, European indentured servants were white, and Europeans, regardless of their origin, still other Europeans, some Europeans were reticent to discipline other Europeans with the same harsh punishment that Africans. Historical evidence suggests that when mixed groups of Africans and European servants ran away, the Africans within the group would receive the harshest punishment. Settlers also attempted to enslave indigenous people. This didn't really satisfy their labor needs. While Europeans did not immediately give up on indigenous labor, ongoing conflict with Native Americans made imported Africans a much more desirable source of labor. Slavery, however, had not yet been defined and codified by law. That wouldn't last. Colonists would soon discover that in order to effectively govern this emergent society, uniform policies would have to be established in order to clearly demarcate social and political hierarchy. Before any legislation passed to solidify the parameters of slavery had been instituted, there were some allowances that enslaved men would experience that would be unfathomable just 20 years down the line. Andrew Johnson, a man who lived in captivity and who eventually worked his way out of bondage, illustrates some of the possibilities for Black people in Jamestown, Virginia, before blanket restrictions were placed on them. While Johnson's story is not representative for all free Black people in the region, it is helpful in understanding the process by which slavery evolved into something more concrete. Let's go to the talk. Only a year after its revival in 1621, Antonio, who later anglicized his name, experienced one of the many bloody conflicts between indigenous communities and colonists. That year, the Powhatan launched an attack on the Bennett family plantation. Antonio was owned by the Bennetts and was one of the few survivors of the attack. He was later commended for his hard labor and known service. The Bennetts then granted Antonio, who would change his name to Anthony Johnson, permission to farm independently on his own land, even though he was still enslaved. He was also allowed to get married, which he did, to a woman named Mary, and to baptize their children. Eventually, Johnson and his family became free, though it's unclear exactly how, which reflects the scarcity of documentation that plagues scholars of early African Americans. Records show that Johnson's land holdings and property were recognized as legitimate by the local government, and after he lost much of his home in a fire, the county court forgave his taxes. He even defended his ownership of an enslaved African in court, stating that the African, John Castor, was not an indentured servant. Castor alleged that Johnson had violated an indenture contract between them. Johnson claimed that he actually purchased Castor as an enslaved worker. Thanks, Buffalo. Sometimes Johnson's story can be used in bad faith to say, hey look, there were black slave holders too. And people do this in an attempt to portray slavery as something that both races participated in and were equally culpable. But those claims ignore the nuances of how the very notion of slavery changed and evolved over time. This point is significant because in the coming years, even the right to speak in court would be stripped from the slave person. Johnson himself exemplified his race and enslavement and slavery. According to scholar Henry Louis Gates, following Johnson's death, the court ruled that he was, quote, a Negro and by consequence, an alien. Subsequently, his family's land was seized and his descendants faded from the historical record. Between 1640 and 1660, who found who could or could not be enslaved became more formalized in the legal system. The John Punch case, one of the most significant in the period, illustrates how courts would begin to differentiate between the two. In 1640, 3 indentured servants, 2 white, 1 black, all fed up with the cruelty, escaped from few
away from
once they were buried, they were caught. They were made to stand trial before Dutchman and the Scotch,
Wait a
30
second.
lakhs,
I'm picking up more
an
chatter on
additional
the
year
Fallen's
indentured
columns.
win, and 3 additional years of manual labor in service to the colony.
Does not leave here alive.
John Hunt, the only African,
It will be done,
he was sentenced to serve for the rest of his life.
Savior, hurry.
Following the John
must
Hunt case,
free me.
planters in Virginia enacted measures that would expressly establish the connection between race and social things. These ideas would help shape future generations of slavery in the United States.
Barracks,
New laws
thanks.
only further cemented the
And
supporting
now
status of black people.
must hide.
In 1662,
Not so fast.
Virginia General
We
Assembly
heard your message.
adopted the rule of
Darkness
artist
walks
sex with
among
events.
us.
The rule
What do you
stated
mean?
that the mother's race
There is no
would
time.
determine the child's
They
slave
are coming.
or free status.
Barracks asks
This
for
policy
your
would
protection
ensure that there would be
once
no
more.
question of the
I will
status
take
of black women,
shelter inside.
even
Succeed,
father has to be
and Barracks will
Fortunately,
reveal
quite intentionally. This set a precedent for how black women's bodies would be used for years to come. What's more, these legal codifications were often justified with religious life. Christians often equated darkness, blackness, and sin. Several biblical passages served as the backbone of the negative and superior attitudes that Europeans had toward Africans. They were described as savage, incapable of governing themselves, and as such, they needed white people in order to suffice to accept them. The essence of this argument is that God, if it's white men, rule over black people, religious doctrine continue to be used by many over the course of centuries in order to justify the forced labor, subjugation, and violence black people experience. Understanding the conditions and development of slave societies in America is crucial to recognize racial and economic disparities that long persisted in the U.S. Grounding ourselves in the origins of how captured Africans thrive in what would eventually become the United States provides us with an important opportunity to explore how the relationship between race, servitude, and bondage evolved over time. The institution of slavery developed and changed over the course of decades, becoming codified in law, more central to the economic certainty. Reviewing the court cases of early Africans in the Americas provides an outlook on the specific rights and liberties denied to Africans compared to the landowning white men by the voice of the early American society. As we dive deeper into Black American experience, just how vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation someone can be. When the law does not see them, the whole person, the implications of it is and is not seen by the law is fully realized by wide-reaching implications as we move forward in America. It's a long way to go, and a lot more to try to make sense. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these techniques, and our animation team is authentic. Crash Course is a reflective production, and if you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everybody, forever, you can support the series at Patreon, the crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content. Thank you to all our patrons for making Crash Course possible.
Something with Silicon Valley High School to make it easier for you to find a personalized tutor for your grades. Unfortunately, Tom didn't know about Silicon Valley High School and decided to go on a quest to find a tutor. He was also a wizard. Now there's a deck. Finding online tutor can be a slow and growing process. Well, Silicon Valley High School is making simply a that all Silicon Valley High School tutors are potential tutors and work with you one-on-one. Wizard?
Yes, I am.
Wait, it's nice. Where are you guys coming out? I feel like you're the
Hurry up, Bob, before I cheat. Let me bestow upon you a long-term contract.
can't find it. I think if you found a wizard.
And it comes with a free one.
It comes with a free one.
And one free one.
One match. In Silicon Valley High School, there are no long-term contracts or subscriptions, so you can book a one-time 30-minute session for only $35.
Varix is
Go ahead, hit the top.
Then prove it. We expect answers.
Wow,
Come
right
to
there.
Varix and you
No, there's a
will
hint.
have them. But
Silicon
know
Valley
that
High School.
our work
School year away.
here has only just begun.
We make USAA classic checking for members like Cassie. She's no nonsense and makes every dollar count. With no monthly service fees, USAA helps her keep more of her money for what matters most. USAA, what you're made of, we're made for.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. It can sometimes feel like lawyers and legislators are always using the law to give us complicated explanations, loopholes, and messy language that leaves most of us feeling like we have absolutely no idea what's going on. And I mean, this is understandable. First of all, the law can be hard to decipher. Second of all, the law is pretty much only as fair as its application. Additionally, we can see in our day-to-day lives that even though something can be legal, it isn't necessarily fair. Sometimes, the law is either designed to be applied in an unjust way, or inherently unjust, especially when those in power have the goal of oppressing and profiting off it. Despite these realities, the beauty of the law, at its best, is that with the right argument and the right application, injustices can be remedied. Today, we're going to talk about that through the story of Elizabeth Key, a woman who obtained her freedom while navigating a deep unjust system. I want to note up top, this episode will address some challenging topics, like sexual violence and images of extreme violence. Elizabeth Key was a biracial woman who was born in Warwick County, Virginia in 1630. She was one of a few enslaved people able to gain her freedom through the colonial legal system. Elizabeth Key's mother was black, but Tanya Lavelle Banks, a legal scholar and professor, states that at the time, there was probably no meaningful difference between being labeled a Negro and being labeled a slave. According to society and the courts, those labels were effectively the same, because at that time and place, almost all people of African descent were assumed to be enslaved. Elizabeth's father was a white Englishman named Thomas Key. who arrived in the family of Virginia in 1616. There is some evidence that Thomas did have some emotional attachment to his daughter. In fact, he attempted to make sure Elizabeth was relatively well provided for, but this didn't come to pass. You see, Elizabeth's parents were unmarried. Not only that, but Thomas Key was legally married to another woman while he was involved with Martha. Due to her complicated status as a black child born out of wedlock and a child born of an enslaved woman, Elizabeth was expected to work as an indentured servant until she was a teenager. Her father made an agreement with a wealthy settler named Humphrey Higginson, who then transferred possession of her to a farmer named John Montreal. She was supposed to be under Higginson's care for 9 years, and that stipulation also transferred to Montreal. Her father, however, died soon after making the initial agreement, and Higginson left for England, just never returned. This left Elizabeth in a vulnerable and uncertain position. She was a teenager of African descent with no advocates. So not only was she ordered into servitude by her own father, the original terms of the agreement also weren't honored. Elizabeth ended up working for John Montreal for 10 additional years, well past the time that had been laid out in the original agreement. In spite of the situation, though, Elizabeth built as much of a life for herself as possible. She started a relationship with a white indentured servant named William Grinstead, and together they had a child named John. When Montreal died in 1655, the heirs of his estate reclassified Elizabeth and her son John, changing them from indentured servants to enslaved. This was an attempt by the estate to take advantage of the small family and acquire more property by declaring them in the chattel. But Elizabeth, she wasn't going to just stand for this. With William Grinstead, a partner turned lawyer, she took this injustice to the court by arguing that Elizabeth was of African ancestry, a woman, and was also considered illegitimate because her parents were unmarried. Montreal Estate argued that
You
Elizabeth
do
was
not trust
Ferrix,
yes,
basically already enslaved.
but leave
But
your
Elizabeth pushed back against
distrust,
this
your
argument.
blame
She made 3
for
points.
later.
The first 2 arguments
The
focused on her
elixir
status
attacked
within
me.
slaveholding Virginia,
She
while the last
is
argument focused on the terms
ship
of the
stealer,
agreement
a
between her
new
father,
Kell of
Higginson,
Kells,
and the later transfer,
unifier
John
of the
Montreal.
houses.
Let's go to the thoughtful.
And
First,
she seeks to
Elizabeth
build an
emphasized that her father
army
was a
of
white free
elixir,
man, and that she
powered
was granted
by
her freedom because of her
darkness.
paternal lineage. Second, Elizabeth
She
stressed that
is not
she was
stopped.
baptized Christian
She will
and that she would
destroy
not be
us
enslaved as a result
all.
of her Christian
You
faith.
must go.
This argument may not really
Ferrix will
resonate
help
with us
you
now.
find
It
your
was
way.
vital in this case because there was some legal debate during this time about whether Christians could, 1, enslave other Christians, and more directly, if Christians themselves could be enslaved for life. On the other hand, English indentured servants that sued for their freedom rarely had to address their Christianity or their lineage. They were assumed to be free and Christian solely because, well, they were white. But Elizabeth was forced to address these key points in her case before addressing the unjust enslavement itself. Which brings us to our third argument. Elizabeth's partner and lawyer, William Grinstead, argued that Key should have been free in the first place because the initial agreement said Elizabeth was only supposed to be an indentured servant for a limited amount of time. And that time had passed. Ultimately, these arguments did compel the court to rule in Elizabeth's favor, freeing both her and her son. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So, this story of lawyers, legislators, and the law actually had a happy ending. Elizabeth and her son were free. She legally married William Grinstead. They all lived happily ever after. Right? I mean, the other side of this is that Elizabeth lost years of her life because she was subject to a woefully unjust system that was designed to protect the practice of holding human beings as property. And it's clear that a white indentured servant, under similar circumstances, would just not be required to jump through any of those legal hoops. Furthermore, many individuals who were subject to similar injustices during this time actually did not receive their freedom, whether they made it to court or not. The reality is that, put simply, Elizabeth was lucky. And if only lucky people win in the legal system, then how just is the system in the first place? The story of Elizabeth Key is a powerful example of perseverance and accountability, and one that's still worth reflecting on today. It's a compelling and even an inspiring story, one of a woman who fought back against the system that attempted to keep her and her son in chains. And she won. But as inspiring as her story is, It also serves as a reminder that Elizabeth's story is the exception to the rule, that the vast majority of people who found themselves in similar positions to Elizabeth, stories like hers are unfortunately just very rare. And it's because they are so rare that they remind us of the larger systemic issues that so many Black people faced. People whose names we'll never know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people and our animation team is ThoughtCap. Crash Course is a Complexly production, and if you'd like to keep Crash Course free for everybody, forever, you can support this series at Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content that you love. Thank you to all our patrons for making Crash Course possible with your continued support.
Saving 10% or more is easy with mobile-only prices on the Booking.com app. Get great deals when you want to get out and explore. Book with the app and find your stay for less at Booking.com.
At Lugoff Toyota, it's always fast, fair, and friendly. Right now, enjoy special lease and finance offers when you upgrade to a safer, more reliable Toyota. Call, come in, or click now for more details at LugoffToyota.com.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith. This is Crash Course Black American History. There are all sorts of ways that societies restrict people's movement. For example, people can put gates and fences around their homes and communities. Or there are traffic cones that tell us where we can and can't drive. Even though sometimes I might accidentally run over. I'm working on it. But some methods that society uses to restrict the movements of people are far more sinister, far more serious, and based on distorted beliefs, have no sincere interest in the safety of those people. What I'm thinking of, in this case, are something called slave codes. Slave codes were based on the belief that Black Americans were just economic investment. They were purposefully designed to condone harming Black Americans and keeping them enslaved. Though some textbooks on slavery and slave codes refer to enslaved people simply as workers, they were not simply workers. They were treated as an underclass, and the legal system perpetuated that underclass status for economic and prejudicial reasons. Learning about slave codes makes all of this profoundly clear. Slave codes were laws and policies developed during the colonial period to restrict the movement and freedoms of Black people. Though they were called slave codes, many times they were applied to free Black people as well. Remember that the distinction between Negro and enslaved was essentially meaningless during this time. The primary reason the slave codes were implemented was to explicitly and legally reinforce the racial hierarchy within the colonies. Slave codes were a method of protecting the investment of white enslavers by restricting the lives of enslaved people in almost every imaginable way. The codes restricted enslaved people's ability to move around or engage in commerce that would make them financially independent. They basically restricted the very opportunities that would allow them to live with even relative freedom. When there were hints of enslaved people questioning their status, or even the possibility of someone planning a revolt, new slave codes were quickly passed to prevent such a thing from happening. Virginia was the first of 13 colonies to implement large-scale slave codes. Since the United States was not quite the United States yet, each colony had their own version of these codes. At the time, they were not yet even referred to as slave codes, but even without the formal title, their purpose remained the same: to fundamentally restrict the rights of Black Americans, free and enslaved, and to explicitly deny them the rights afforded to white members of society. Let's take a look at an example. In 1662, Virginia passed this statute. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman should be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother, and that if any Christian shall commit fornication with a Negro man or woman, he or she so offending shall pay double the fines imposed by the former act. After Elizabeth Key's case in 1656, which we talked about last episode, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed this official law. It mandated what's known as partis sequitur ventrum, determining one's enslaved status based on their mother's labor status, as the legal method to determine whether an individual is enslaved or not. Some scholars, such as Jennifer L. Morgan, posit that it was actually Key's freedom suit that drove the Virginia House of Burgesses to create this law in the first place, a law that was also designed to discourage intimate interracial relations between black and white people in the colonies. Virginia didn't just stop there. In 1705, Virginia passed another law dedicated to regulating the movement and behavior of enslaved people. It was called an Act Concerning Servants and Slaves. This act banned black people from owning white servants and penalized those who presided over the marriage between a white and black person. It banned enslaved people from owning weapons. Other laws around the same time banned black people, regardless of their servitude status, from testifying against whites in court. You might think that in a country where those same colonists would soon be demanding freedom while espousing the importance of liberty and equality for themselves, that those same people would be a bit more, concerned about liberty and equality for everyone. But the truth is, America's promise and America's actions are very often inconsistent. Let's go to the thought bubble. In 1671, Maryland passed a law stating that even if an enslaved person converted to Christianity, that conversion did not change their servitude status. This was important because of the legal debate around whether Christians could be enslaved. In a place like South Carolina, they built a whole society around slave codes. They did it, as they all did, for both economic and societal reasons. These codes banned black people from engaging in any type of trade, did not allow for enslaved folks to travel without notice from their enslaver, banned enslaved black Americans from keeping loud instruments like drums and horns, and gave law enforcement the authority to search enslaved black people and to whip them if they appeared to be engaging in what was deemed disorderly behavior. Many of these codes showed up after slave rebellions, when enslavers were particularly interested in protecting themselves and their property from enslaved people who wanted them free. Enslaved codes weren't just in the southern colonies. New York, for example, had their own set of these laws. The 1702 Slave Code in New York banned people from trading with enslaved people at all. It also prohibited 3 or more enslaved people from meeting together at the same time. From 1703 to 1704, Rhode Island banned the enslaved from being out after 9 o'clock at night unless they had what was deemed a lawful excuse. Pennsylvania, they also had infamous slave codes. Punishment for offenses committed by white and black people could be deeply and even legally punished.
Barracks can
Or an offense committed by a white person might result with them being whipped or branded. A black person charged with committing a similar offense might be killed. Thanks, Thought Bubble. White colonists worked overtime to make sure that the law was used to urge and restrain black Americans, just because of the color of their skin and their place in the American economy. In early colonial history, white indentured servants and enslaved black people actually had somewhat similar positions in society. But as we've seen in this episode, that wouldn't last. Colonial governments created specific laws that would clearly and legally demarcate what a white person could have and which rights the black person could have. Or perhaps, more appropriately, which rights they couldn't have. I'm sure that many people look at these laws and are appalled that such things ever passed. But it's important to note that while today such discrimination might not be explicitly stated in the language of the law itself, laws across the country have different implications and are often enforced differently based on someone's race. This impacts jobs, housing, and our criminal legal system, our schools. The list goes on. Looking back, it can be hard to stomach that our country never experienced horrific slavery. But it's important to note that, as is the case throughout Black American history, people pushed back against these laws because they knew they were wrong. Later in this series, we're going to learn about the myriad ways that Black people have resisted injustice. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Crash Course is made with the help of all these nice people and our animation team is talking. Crash Course is flexing production. If you'd like to see Crash Course free for everybody, crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content that you need. So thanks to all of our patrons for making Crash Course possible.
lost 52 pounds, that's every day. And I feel like a brand new person. I have energy for days. It is everything I've been working for to be healthy for my future family.
Go to www.com to see today's limited time offer.
As experts in online education, Purdue University Global gives you all the flexibility you need to balance school, work, and life. Take classes 100% online to fit your schedule, your pace, and your personal budget. Learn how to save on tuition and time online at Purdue Global.
Hi, I'm Clint Smith, and this is Crash Course Black American History. If you're like me, you love breakfast. Waffles, French toast, bacon, sausage, you name it, I am here for it. And one of the breakfast food that I love, and that my kids really love, is oatmeal. Especially with some raisins, diced strawberries, and some cinnamon. Man, shout out to Quaker Oats. Speaking of which, do you ever wonder why they're even called Quaker Oats? Part of the reason we have a random 17th century Quaker man on the front of the box is because people have long associated Quakers with qualities of goodness, peace, honesty, which are qualities we love to see in people and in your oatmeal. For the record, Quaker Oats have no association with the actual Quakers. Anyway, today we're going to take a closer look at Quakers in early America, including their varying opinions and relationships with slavery, which led to many disagreements with them, as well as one of the first abolitionist documents in the North American continent. By the late 1600s, British North America had become well accustomed to the practice of slavery. Though it was not nearly as integral to the economy of the North as it was to the South, the practice did expand rapidly, including the Delaware Valley region of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Slavery in this region began in 1684 with the arrival of some 150 captives aboard the British vessel, the Isabella. The slave ship brought a highly sought-after commodity to Philadelphia, free labor, tapping into the colonists' desire to obtain their own enslaved workers. Soon, enslaved Africans would make up around a seventh of the city's entire population. The colony of Pennsylvania had been founded by a man named William Penn, who himself was a Quaker, but not the man on the Quaker Oats box. The Quakers, whose denomination of Christianity developed in England in the mid-17th century, were also a significant portion of the Philadelphia population during the time. Quakers' beliefs were pretty different, and in some ways radically different than other Christians. For example, they were one of the first to argue that individuals realize spiritual freedom through their own inner life, that people could communicate directly with God. So priests weren't really needed to do. Quakers were also well known as the forerunners of the abolition movement. But as always with Christianity, this should make clear that even though Quakers as a whole were at the forefront of abolitionist work, in the denomination, there were people who really didn't from them. Some Quakers, far from being abolitionists or even indifferent to chattel slavery, even participated in the transatlantic slave trade themselves. In the 17th century, many Quakers in the Caribbean, for example, purchased captives in Barbados in what some of them rationalized as a form of an effort, they say, to civilize these Africans, convert them to Christianity. In her book, Christian Slavery, historian Catherine Gerbner discusses the experiences of English Quaker George Fox to highlight some of the complexities of Quaker history when it comes to the issue of slavery. She emphasizes the stark contrast between Quakers who held anti-slavery beliefs and those whose primary concern was maintaining, quote, well-ordered Quaker households with Christian slaves. Fox, regarded as the founder of Quakerism, was already a proponent of universal evangelization. And during a trip to Barbados in 1671, when he had the opportunity to witness slavery firsthand, his conception of Christianity was made to confront slavery directly. You might think that witnessing the violence and barbarity of enslavement would have deeply unsettled anyone who purports to have Christian views, and would have made clear to them that slavery was inconsistent with their faith, right? Well, no. Instead, during his trip, Fox spoke of what he saw as deplorable promiscuity and polygamous relationships among the enslaved, even though we should note There were often forced breeding practices imposed on them. And Fox said that he was shocked and angered to find that plantation owners in Barbados had no intention of trying to convert their labor force to Christianity, something that he saw as essential. So no, it wasn't the horrific, violent nature of Caribbean slavery that set him over the edge. Instead, it was the belief that, quote, the gospel should be preached to every creature under heaven. Apparently, he saw no contradiction between the idea of a loving God and the barbarous institution in front of him that was perpetuated in God's name. We should note that Fox wasn't alone in what we today clearly see as a moral paradox. This evangelical approach, which provided justification for those participating in the slave trade, was actually not considered controversial at the time. In Pennsylvania, it was not uncommon for Quaker leaders to own enslaved laborers. Even William Penn, founder of Pennsylvania, purchased laborers from Quakers who owned plantations in Barbados. Penn and other Quaker leaders simply believed that slavery was necessary to secure the economic welfare of this developing population. There were, however, still many Quakers who opposed slavery on moral grounds, and Quakers would later become one of the most influential white religious groups to lead anti-slavery protests. They even provided direct aid to the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. Let's go to the thought bubble. In 1688, 4 German-Dutch Quaker men presented what would become known as the Germantown Protest at a monthly local meeting in Dublin, Pennsylvania. But we're not talking about a big public protest like with signs and chanting or anything like that. This was a written protest, a petition, with a list of demands advocating that the Quakers form a united front and publicly endeavor to end slavery. The 4 men who drafted this petition made their complaints based on fundamental Quaker beliefs that each human being is a The Germantown petition, named for the location where it was drafted, became one of the first formal documents to denounce the institution of slavery on moral and practical grounds. These Quakers openly challenged the logic behind slavery and the violence enslaved laborers rejected. Fortunately, although many prominent Quakers shared these sentiments, they weren't willing to turn those sentiments into action. The primary course document at the time revealed that it received a less than enthusiastic response. After listening to the petitioners and expecting that, the official response to the meeting was that, given the nature of the complaint, it was best that they not, quote, meddle in the issue. They claimed it was too weighty of a problem for them to try and resolve at that time. They decided to pass the issue off to a board meeting. Then it was passed to officials at the yearly meeting, where ultimately the full gathering would also reject the petition. Thanks, Papa. Even though the petition was ultimately unsuccessful, the way it laid out the hypocrisy of many of their fellow Quakers was significant. In their draft, these Quaker men called out the hypocrisy of enslavement, pointing out that it was in direct violation of several fundamental Christian doctrines. The petition pointed out that enslaving people is a pretty direct violation. The petition read in part, "We shall do to all men like as we will be done unto them, making no difference what generation, descent, or color they are." Petitioners also appealed to the strong sense of family that was central to Quaker beliefs. They stated that African families had no chance of survival under the oppressive institution of slavery. Pray, what thing in the world can be done worse towards us than if men should rob or steal us away and sell us for slaves to strange countries, separating husbands from their wives and children. They also made a special note that you shouldn't buy stolen goods, framing it as a larger moral issue tied to slavery. We who profess that it is not lawful to steal must likewise avoid to purchase things as are stolen, but rather help stop them robbing if possible. It's important because in the petition it expressed that Africans were captives brought to the Americas against their will, and for that reason, they too are stolen. Our impassioned petitioners even suggested that the hypocrisy was so blatant, so egregious, protecting other areas of the world from migrating to Pennsylvania because of the clear contradiction of their values and practices. Given the social and political context of the moment, it's perhaps not that surprising that this petition was rejected by landowning white men who were still working to establish their place in the American continent. But the letter itself is still important for us to learn about because it serves as documentation of abolitionist thought among white liberals in the United States. Moreover, it served as a strong ideological foundation for many Quakers who were later even more actively engaged in the abolitionist movement spanning the 18th and 19th centuries. So, as you can see, there were some groups, or groups within groups, of white immigrants who did recognize the maltreatment of enslaved Africans, whose fight against it is documented in writings from well over 300 years ago. And their argument is rooted in something that most colonial regions relate to: Christianity. The four Quaker men who presented the Germantown Petition in 1688 drew inspiration from the Bible to make plain the contradictions and the inhumanity of slavery. At the same time, as we saw in the case of George Fox, it would be too simple to suggest that these were the beliefs of all Quakers. They weren't. It's important for us to complicate and problematize any rhetoric that suggests that all Quakers were enslaved. Many were, but certainly not all. And this should be a lesson we carry with us throughout our journey through all of American history. We should be wary of overgeneralizing any group. There are often a range of opinions, perspectives, and ideas that exist within any group. Quakers are others. Germantown protests showcase the significance of white people recognizing that they themselves had a moral and fight for justice. This is the concept that will return to the Washington. Crash Course Black American History is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thoughtcast. Crash Course is a collective production, and if you'd like to keep Crash Course for everybody, forever, you can support this series with Patreon, a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content. Thanks to all our patrons for making Crash Course possible.
Okay guys, so this is the ultimate life hack for buying all the cheap gaming stuff for cheap. Okay, so first, go to one of your favorite gaming websites. Select the products you want, then click the Honey browser extension. Boom, literally money saved. So click here on the left side to start saving money on your favorite gaming products and pretty much anything else you can buy online. Add money today for free by clicking on the left side or by visiting joinmoney.com.
Are you looking for a quicker and more affordable way to find a tutor? Luckily with Silicon Valley High School, they make it easier for you to find a personalized tutor with a click. Unfortunately, Tom didn't know about Silicon Valley High School and decided to go on a quest to find a tutor. He's also a wizard. Not even dead. Finding an online tutor can be a slow and growing problem. For Silicon Valley High School, they make it simple and easy to find. With a few simple clicks, you can take a tutor instantly and from anywhere. That's because all Silicon Valley High School tutors are credentialed tutors and will work with you one-on-one to improve your education. Hey, are you the wizard?
Yes, I am.
Again to drill for glimmer. So comes your chance to disrupt them.
Before I teach, let me bestow upon you a long-term contract.
Okay, look, you found the wizard.
And it comes with a free one.
It comes with the free one.
For a free one.
What's that? With Silicon Valley High School, there are no long-term contracts or subscriptions, so you can book a one-time 30-minute session for only $35.
Go ahead, pick it up.
And they're gone. Wow, right there.
Look at this.
Silicon Valley High School. Good school your way.
Hi, I'm Lynn Smith. This is Crash Course Black American. As we mentioned before, sleep is the main. Oftentimes, when we fall, the person going down the kitchen work, things that might slow down the efficiency of the system and give back to the enslaved some small symptom. There were also times when that resistance became larger, more dramatic, like the slave uprising, the rebellion. We should note that notions of what constitutes as a successful versus an unsuccessful rebellion are often subjective, unhelpful, tender. It was really not the state back then. Such a rebellion took place at all. Still, some of these uprisings have taken on notable historical. Today, we're going to talk about one. That's the Stone Rebellion. Large plantations with black people outnumbered white people in slave networks was not at all uncommon for slavery in America. This was especially true in South Carolina, where the colony was built on the demands of cash crop production. Raising cash crops like tobacco and rice gave rise to plantations that were designed to grow as much of that valuable crop as possible. And what those plantations needed, more than anything, was labor. The heavy reliance on slavery to the colonial economy resulted in vast demand for practice. In South Carolina, a high demand for enslaved labor led to a black majority in the colony. By the year 1740, slavery in the colony was no longer characterized only by African captives, but had grown to black people who were born on American soil. The population of black people in South Carolina had risen to approximately 40,000 compared to 20,000 white people, making black people about 2/3 of the colony's entire population. Moreover, ships were still bringing large numbers back to the capital of South Carolina, adding to the growing enslaved population. This demographic in the colony began to change. My planters began to worry about these strong numbers and about the potential for violent resistance. But instead of, deciding that slavery was an unethical and morally unsustainable enterprise, they just decided to fight potential fire. Fire. In response to the growing numbers of enslaved black people in the colony, in August of 1739, South Carolina passed a law requiring all white men to carry firearms in church. It wasn't customary for white men in South Carolina to carry weapons in church. And also on Sundays, black people regularly worked in the food line. But these planters wanted to be ready at a moment's notice, anywhere they went, to protect themselves and enslaved people they were worried might turn on them. Notably, the act passed before the Stone Rebellion would go into effect for another 2 weeks. The Stone Rebellion took place in 1902. Also heightening the generalized sense of white fear in South Carolina was the Spanish threat brewing in nearby Spanish-controlled ports. And although they also practiced slavery, the Spanish were intent on disrupting colonial life in the English territory. So, the Spanish further disrupted the racial dynamics in the English colony by issuing a proclamation that, with only a few stipulations, including converting to Catholicism, Spain would grant freedom to any black person who could make it to St. Augustine, Florida. Many captives coming to Charlestown, which is present-day Charleston, came from areas in West Central Africa, where the Portuguese had spread their language and religious beliefs. Many of them would have been aware of the 1733 offer. A growing black population, including some African natives not yet fully accustomed to plantation culture, in combination with the Spanish offer, created the perfect storm for the Stono Rebellion to take place. This insurrection would become the largest the colony would ever face, and one of the bloodiest in the United States history. Let's go to the bumper. The Stono Rebellion, which erupted on Sunday, September 9, 1739, was led by an enslaved man named Jemmy. Jemmy, and those who fought alongside him, chose Sunday to revolt because they believed that it presented the best conditions to actually pull this thing off, given that all the planters and their families were at church, and the enslaved were working largely in the supermarket. We don't know too much about Jemmy. Historical records suggest that he was from what is now Angola, and many enslaved Africans who came to Carolina from Angola were in fact trained soldiers who fought war and experience done. Jemmy may have been able to do what he did, which included the likelihood heard of the 1733 Spanish proclamation. Starting with just 20 enslaved people, Jemmy and the group acquired guns and ammunition by raiding a warehouse and marched up the Stono River bank, carrying banners that plainly read, as they marched south, others, seeing what was happening, dropped their tools in one. By nightfall, about 12 to 100 black people willing to risk it all. The rebels hoped to make their way to St. Augustine. Just 10 miles later, when they reached the Modesto River, white colonists overtook them, killing an estimated 30 rebels. While some initially escaped, many were ultimately captured and executed. Others were sold and shipped off to the Caribbean. As for Jemmy, historians aren't really sure what happened to him. He's lost in the missing pages of history. Thanks, Tom. These attacks weren't haphazard or indiscriminate. Many of the rebels had specific ideas of who they wanted to attack and who they didn't. As a result, some white people were spared along the way. A local tavern owner, for example, known to be relatively kind to slavery, was potentially left. Some of these slaves even protected their enslavers from violence. One group shielded the Quaker man named Thomas Jefferson while hiding from the rebels as they approached. The Stono Rebellion was a moment of clarity for South Carolina, and they wanted to make sure that something like this would never happen. But again, it's telling that they did not come to the conclusion that maybe slavery, the idea of holding large generations of cattle bondage, was actually real bondage. Instead, they blamed the enslaved, and they blamed the Spanish. The South Carolina government claimed that the Negroes would not have made this insurrection had they not depended on St. Augustine for a place of reception practice. Following the rebellion, South Carolina's House of Assembly passed a law called an Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Other Slaves. If this sounds like the slave code mentioned previously, you're right. It does. The legislation enacted by the South Carolina House of Assembly became another legal avenue to block Africans from obtaining any rights to work. Among the new statutes and limitations was a policy that made it illegal for enslaved people to learn how to read and write. Throughout the era of slavery, plaintiffs wanted to prevent enslaved people from learning to read and write for a range of reasons. In this case, many patriots proud display of their liberty banner, as well as their knowledge of the Spanish policy, proved that there were huge consequences for white plaintiffs who allowed their laborers to become free. This idea would remain relevant more than 100 years later. In an 1845 memoir, Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved writer, orator, and abolitionist, quoted his own flavor on the subject of literacy and slavery. Teach him how to read. There will be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be enslaved. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to society. This was an existential fear for the plaintiff, who feared that literacy would allow enslaved people to recognize words, written rules, and directions that could help them develop plans. They even worried that enslaved might force them. For official documents that free black people needed to prove their free status, as they could be stopped and questioned by suspected whites at any time. White enslavers also enforced illiteracy to ensure that enslaved people couldn't form their own interpretations of biblical texts, because many whites used the idea of evangelism and bringing Christianity to people justification of their enslavement. Many laborers were required to attend church services and listen to sermons that interpreted scripture, meaning that God intended for Africans to be enslaved to Europeans, and that obedience to one's enslaver was necessary for them to get into heaven. So the thinking was, if enslaved people learned how to read and write, they might come to understand that these preachings that they had heard from their enslavers were actually being manipulated to serve their own ideological ends. And to put the cherry on top, schools were established in South Carolina to indoctrinate enslaved people with this ideological interpretation of Christianity. These schools taught black people to believe that the institution of slavery was ordained by God and should not be challenged. This message stimulated the hopes of discouraging any further violent conduct. Authorities in South Carolina also created a policy that they hoped might shift the demographics of the state. According to historian Peter Wood, after the Stono Rebellion, slave importations were cut by nearly 90% in the 1740s, and policies were put in place to encourage immigration from Europe, with the goal of increasing the white population in the colony. There were also some half-hearted attempts to improve, call it that, the treatment of enslaved people. Plaintiffs could be penalized for especially cruel punishment and for imposing excessive work. Legislators hoped that the improved conditions might be of the rebellion. But the phrases cruel punishment and excessive work should be understood in context. Treating enslaved people with less cruelty, but continuing to keep them enslaved, is really an act of benevolence. Therefore, we should be careful to note that these stipulations did not make slavery more humane in South Carolina. Slavery is still slavery. The record of the Stono Rebellion highlights the courage and bravery of enslaved black people who were willing to go to extreme lengths to gain their I guess when you put it that way, it's not so different from the stories we've often told of Americans who are willing to sacrifice their lives for the prospect of living. Those who led and participated in the Stono Rebellion were not the first to rebel violently against slavery and power, would certainly not be the last. And remember, the time to determine whether a rebellion was successful or not kind of misses the point. The Stono Rebellion isn't important because of its relative success or failure. It's important because it is emblematic of a resistance that will echo throughout the history of slavery. I hope that with this in mind, we continue to celebrate the myriad forms of resistance that Black Americans did. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Crash Course Black American History is made with the help of all these nice people and our animation talk. Crash Course is a Superflex production. Taking like Crash Course for everybody, forever. You can support the series and a crowdfunding platform that allows you to support the content. Thank you all our patrons for making Crash Course possible and continue to.
Article for this. I like it. Mike and Honorable. Mike billions, that's right, billions in mortgage financial assistance for struggling investors. Bad news. Experts are warning homeowners who might not have money. You can't wait around for it, and you owe less than $356,000 on your home, and you haven't missed a single mortgage payment in 6 months. Congress's mortgage stimulus program for the middle class. You're welcome. You'll be shocked to see what this is. Tap the Learn More button below to calculate your new house payment.
A promise made in the dark, lit by a single flame. A desperate prayer for guidance, for direction, for a sign. And in return, a vow to one day build a shrine in the name of all who are hopeless. This was the beginning, quiet and solemn. But soon, this sacred vow would become a mission. As the light from that single candle grew into a torch of promise, passed through time and generations to millions around the world. As that vision took form, it would be given a name and a purpose, and a statue would be raised as a proud symbol of that hope, one that would stand watch over desperate families, protecting and guiding them in their darkest hour. This is where the work would be done, forever changing the fates of children diagnosed with cancer and other life-threatening diseases. This is where brilliant minds would gather, perched at the leading edge of science, as they ventured into the darkness, seeking better ways to understand, treat, and defeat the diseases that took children's lives. Hundreds of supporters would grow into thousands, then millions, fueling the work required to raise survival rates and keep families whole. What was once a death sentence for children would ultimately become survivable, as word of this remarkable place spread around the globe. Momentum continued to build, and people from all walks of life would lend their support, united by the singular vision that no child should die at the dawn of life. This is St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Since 1962, when St. Jude first opened its doors, we have stayed true to the promise that no family would ever receive a bill from St. Jude, not for treatment, travel, housing, or food, because all a family should worry about is helping their child live. And St. Jude freely shares its groundbreaking discoveries, so that every child saved at St. Jude means that doctors and scientists can use that knowledge to save thousands more children around the world.
It's pretty amazing when you consider 7 years ago, we didn't have a treatment plan now. We cure 80% of children with cancer.
If you think about that, go back 50 years and turn pregnancy. This is the miracle story of modern medicine.
Our mission continues to unite people from all walks of life in a common goal, to support the research and the patient care necessary to at last vanquish the pediatric captives and take our children from us.
Donors are important to us because we get the feeling that we have this behind. We get the resources, we get the focus, and so we see through those people who will.
My father, Daniel Thomas, once said, "Those who support the good are as those who do the good." And these very words have been embraced by millions for more than half a century. Thank you for the St. Children's Research Hospital and for carrying forward the light in our family. With your help, we will continue to find cures and save more children here and around the world. We won't stop until my father's dream is realized, that no child should die in the dawn of life.
Hi, I'm Princeton. This is Crash Course Black America. We spent a lot of time in this series talking about how hard it was to be a black person in college and how colonial law oppressed people of Africans. I think most of us have lived these circumstances and wondered how anyone survived, how people were able to wake up every day, going to most of them they define themselves by the families they the culture they American culture, from music, the arts, the literature, would not be what it is today without the creativity, ingenuity, and brilliance of enslaved people. They created art that spoke to the conditions around them. And it's hard to imagine what life might look like on the other side of the future. It was art that served as both a mirror for their lives and a window to what their lives might one day. Today, we're going to talk about a teenager who embodied this and who, with her stunning poetry, began to change the way that others black people become. Put on your bonnet, pick up your quilt, because today, we're talking about food. Let's start this. Was the first speech of a black woman ever published. You need to think about Western poetry and liberty. After all, most high school students back in the West often need to center the work of people like Cummings, Walt Whitman, Shakespeare, Frost, and Homer. And while a bunch of these folks are great, it's important to note that the West does not have a monopoly on poetry. Just because it's taught that a certain type of poetry is considered standard, it doesn't mean we shouldn't interrogate the very notion of who's deciding what is or isn't considered standard. There are many other important examples of literature that came from the African continent, like the Timbuktu Manuscript, epic texts and oral poems like the Epic of Europe, and literature written by the kings of the Arrogant even within her era. Phyllis Wheatley was not the first black woman poet. Before Wheatley, for example, there was Lucy Terry Prince, who wrote her poem Bars Fight, 1746, but it wasn't published until about 100 years later. Phyllis Wheatley was born around 1753 in the Gambia River region of West Africa. She was taken captive when she was about 8 years old and, like millions of others, brought across the Atlantic world. After arriving in New England in 1761, she was sold to a couple named John and Susanna Wheatley. His daughter had died 9 years earlier, and historians like Vincent Coretta have speculated that their grief led them to treat Phyllis as a surrogate for their late daughter. This is another example of the complexity and cognitive dissonance of slavery. Purchasing a human child to replace the human child that you lost. It's a lot to unpack here, than therapists. Anyway, Phyllis was brought to the United States following the religious movement that emphasized the importance of conversion through a process of spiritual rebirth, accepting Jesus Christ in one's person. Three theologians that started this movement were Methodist Anglicans who came from the Church of England. They were John Wesley, his brother Charles Wesley, and George Whitefield was known for his religiosity and passion. And he was one of Phyllis's greatest heroes. He traveled through the country, preaching and sharing his ideas about the great. His messages not only influenced the broader American public through poets like Phyllis, but also introduced the first generation of Black Christian authors to Methodism. And there's a lot of them. They included Alada Adriano, Brigham Hammond, Jupiter Hammond, James Albert Pearsall, John Morant, Boston. Phyllis had what was in many ways an unusual upbringing relative to the plight of most of the slaves. Yes, some enslaved people were brought to church, but Phyllis also was allowed to learn to read and write. In fact, within 4 years of arriving in Boston, Phyllis was literate and eloquent enough in the English language to write a letter to a minister and compose a short poem mourning the death of the people. But her big break came in 1770, when she published a poem about George Whitefield, whom she had first heard preach when she was a young child. Let's go to the talk. Welcome to Crash Course Poetry. I'm your host, Clint Smith. Wow, we have a full house tonight. Ben Franklin, good to see you. Sorry, man, you're gonna have to leave that kite outside. Wesley Brothers, didn't expect to see you tonight. I thought you had a sermon to give. So, being a bit of a poet myself, I'm happy to introduce the young legend in the making. Hailing from Boston, Massachusetts, show your love for Miss Phyllis Wheatley. She will be performing an excerpt from her piece with quite the title, an elegiac poem on the death that celebrated the divine and eminent servant of Jesus Christ, the late Reverend and pious George Whitefield. Hail, happy saint, on thy immortal throne. For thee complaints of grievance are unknown. We hear no more the music of thy tongue. Thy wanted auditory speech was wrong. Let them hear that will access road, while emulation goes to road. Thou didst in strains of eloquence refine, flame the soul, captivate the mind. His lonely tabernacle sees no more. A Whitefield landing on the British shore. Then let us view him in yon azure skies. Let every mind with this loved object rise. No more can he exert his laboring breath, seized by the cruel messenger of death. What can his dear America return, but drop a tear upon his happy urn? Thou tomb shalt safe retain thy sacred trust, till life divine reanimate his dust. Thanks, Thought Bubble. This poem was an 18th century banger, and it propelled Phyllis Wheatley to fame. As her success grew, she became a symbol of the intellectual abilities of people of African descent, and thus became an important part of the anti-slavery movement. You see, during this time, white people viewed black people as less intelligent, but Phyllis's poetry directly countered that false stereotype. Historian Winthrop Jordan has written that Phyllis Wheatley ultimately became an anti-slavery both prized and critical. Her name virtually a household term for the Negroes as well. Another historian, Justin Barnes, stated in her work that Phyllis forced the American colonists to question their ideas about black people's intellect and humanity. Remember, it was not uncommon for African Americans to legally analogize to horses and other animals during this period. But Phyllis's capacity to not only learn, but to become an artist who wrote beautiful poetry forced many white people to ask, were black people actually just like us? Many famous white philosophers who have been largely celebrated for their intellectual contributions, like Francis Bacon, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, were also people who debated the cognitive, emotional, and moral capacity of black people and questioned if they were really fully people at all. Phyllis Wheatley's literary success even brought into question what they believed. Her influence in the debate about black humanity lasted well past 1773, when she finally gained her freedom. But not everyone was convinced of Phyllis's talent. Thomas Jefferson, for example, wrote in his 1785 book, Notes on the State of Virginia, misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches in poetry. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. Love is the peculiar ostrom of the poet. Their love is ardent, but it kindles the senses only, not the imagination. Religion indeed has produced a Phyllis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. The compositions published under her name are below the dignity of criticism. Jefferson, of course, was wrong. It's not the only time Jefferson was wrong on race. Far from it. In that same book, he wrote he had a suspicion that black people are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. Jefferson's quite blatant racism in Notes on the State of Virginia is a reminder that the story we often hear about how great the Founding Fathers were doesn't always tell the full story. But I digress. This isn't about him. This is about Phyllis. Wheatley would die prematurely at the age of 31 on December 5th, 1784. But she accomplished so much over the course of her life. She published poems on various subjects, religious and moral, in 1773. This made her the first English-speaking person of African descent to publish a book, and the second American woman of any race to do so. She was also the most visible black woman in New England during the American Revolutionary era. According to the historians Catherine Adams and Elizabeth Fleck, Phyllis Wheatley was the best-known black person in all the colonies, hailed as a poetic genius, widely praised for her literary talent. Her life was in many ways the exception to the common condition of black women of her place in time. What's more, she created a moment of accountability for the American colonies. Phyllis Wheatley brought into question the false assumption that black people are greatness, intelligent thought, and art. We should be clear, though, that while Phyllis's life and work are worthy of celebration and commemoration, it should not have been necessary for black people to write and publish poetry in order to justify their humanity. Phyllis's humanity was not contingent on whether or not she wrote these poems. Her humanity was always there, simply because she was human. That's enough. It's enough for Phyllis and for every other enslaved person. Still, her life is noteworthy. Her work has lived long beyond her time, and she remains a remarkable example of how the gifts of people of African descent shine even under the most inhumane of circumstances. Phyllis Wheatley created the bedrock upon which generations of black writers would flourish. Poets like Robert Hayden, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, and Claudia Rankine are all part of her lineage. Even rappers like Lauryn Hill or Kendrick Lamar can look at the impact of Phyllis Wheatley on black poetry and rhetoric as a part of their own origin story. So, whether you're bopping to the Fugees or Drake, thank Phyllis Wheatley. She really did pave the way for so many of us. Crash Course Black American History is made with the help of all these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe. Crash Course is a Complexity production.